Good morning and welcome. So glad to have you all here today. Today we have the special pleasure of having a guest speaker, Hakuin David Brazier Roshi, who is a author, a longtime Buddhist practitioner, a psychotherapist by profession, and a teacher well known for his teachings of Buddhist psychology. Carol and I got to know David Brazier first through a book of his entitled The Dark Side of the Mirror. And this was a commentary on a teaching of Eihei Dogen, the founder of Japanese Soto Zen, about one of Dogen's teachings, the Genjo Koan, a dense text that really benefits from commentary by people who have studied it in depth. And reading David's book was transformative for both of us in the understanding of the Genjo Koan and in the understanding of Zen Buddhism in general. So we contacted him at that time and have had multiple exchanges since, including attending a course he taught on the Genjo Koan. Today he's going to be talking about a foundational text in Zen Buddhism, a text attributed to Bodhidharma. And this text is entitled, according to at least one translation, Two Entries and Four Practices. We're so happy to have Brazier Roshi here today to talk with us about this and look forward to hearing it. And afterwards, there'll be time for a few questions and comments. Thank you for being here. Welcome. You are being recorded now.
Oh, interesting. Usually there's an announcement. Okay, so what I'd like to do this evening is try and give you some idea of the teaching of Bodhidharma. This is no simple task if you consider that he lived in the 6th century. That's sort of 1500 years ago, in an extremely different culture with a different history, different spiritual background to the one that we have here in the West. Bodhidharma is generally billed as being the founder of Zen in China. So what we're talking about here is the beginnings of Zen. And Zen has changed a lot over the centuries. So trying to get some sense of this early stage. I don't claim to have magical knowledge of it. But I'll give you as much as I can get out of it. As I've already said, Bodhidharma is usually billed as the founder of Zen, but many of the ideas that were fundamental to his teaching also had a history. Some of that history was in India, and some of it was in China. We can say that, speaking broadly, Zen brings together at least two different strands of traditional Buddhism. The Yogacara school, which was one of the first Mahayana schools of Buddhism, and the Sarvastivada, sometimes called Hinayana form of Buddhism. Bodhidharma's own teacher, Prajñatara, Hanyatara in Japanese, was a Sarvastivadin. She lived in the south of India, and according to the legend, she told her disciple, Bodhidharma, that he should go to China. And about 20 years after she died, he did indeed go to China. And most of our stories about Bodhidharma start there, where he arrives in China. But clearly he'd had some decades of Sarvastivada teaching in the background. And you can see traces of Sarvastivada all the way through Zen history, certainly in Dogen. This is not kind of that evident to most people because the Sarvastivada school no longer exists. And it didn't leave an awful lot of trace. Most of what we know about it, we know about people from other schools who wrote about it, not always in a complimentary way. So you have to sort of intuit, divine what was going on there. But it's quite interesting, Asti Vada could be translated into English as existentialism. And Sarvastivada means the school of all existence. So the notion of all existence there was that the past, the present, and the future are all equally real, amongst other things. This is also a very interesting notion, which you can contrast with modern Zen ideas about only the present exists and so on. Anyway, this was in the background of Bodhidharma. But as I say, there were also roots in China. A claim could be made, and has been made by some people, that the real founder of Zen was Tao Sheng, who lived 100 years or so before Bodhidharma. And Tao Sheng lived at the time when he was contemporary with Lushan Huiyuan and Kumarajiva, who were two of the most formative teachers in the early history of Buddhism, who lived around about the year 400. Kumarajiva did many of the great translations, Lotus Sutra and many, many other sutras. And Huiyuan on Mount Lu, he was the first great Pure Land Buddhist teacher in China. And but he was also very what we would call ecumenical. Mount Lu, where he lived, became a center for all the major schools of Buddhism in China, and many people would go there. I gather it's a very beautiful place, and there were Daoist temples and Confucian temples and Buddhist temples, and Huiyuan developed a community there, who all made a vow to be born together in the Pure Land. Well, Tao Sheng spent quite a bit of time on Mount Lu, and he also spent quite a bit of time with Kumarajiva. And he became really something of a bridge between these two great figures. But he was also a great thinker in his own right. And some of the ideas that we associate with Bodhidharma and with Zen seem to have started with Tao Sheng. Certainly the idea of sudden awakening was an idea that he very much established. And he was also famous for a controversy because there was around that time a big concern about, well, the way we would put it nowadays is does everybody have Buddha nature? And there was an idea that there were people called Ichandika, people who had committed great sins, would not have Buddha nature. And one of the texts brought from India suggested this, and it became a widespread idea. And Tao Sheng said, no, this can't be right. Everybody must have Buddha nature. And he was much criticized for this and was in effect excommunicated. He was defrocked for having this heretical idea. And he said, well, I know it says in that sutra that this is the case, but the translation we've got, it must be from a corrupted original. Well, a few years later, a new translation arrived from India, and it validated what he'd said. And this was sort of an amazing marvel that he had divined that this must be the case. And so Tao Sheng became quite famous in this respect. And his sort of intuition and sense of the Dhamma was greatly respected. Now, Tao Sheng is usually classified as a Buddhist, but is sometimes classified as a neo-Daoist. This is significant for I'll get around to Bodhidharma, don't worry. The neo-Daoism is a hybrid of Taoism and Confucianism. And around this time, early 5th century, time when Tao Sheng was active, this neo-Taoism became very widespread. It's also called the dark wisdom, which is very interesting to me, having written a book called The Dark Side of the Mirror, and thinking about light and dark, yin and yang, all these kinds of ideas. So Tao Sheng used a lot of Taoist terminology at this stage of the introduction of Buddhism into China. People were unsure how best to represent the Buddhist ideas in the Chinese language. Kumarajiva, who I've mentioned, he coined a whole load of new Chinese words to do this. But before that, very largely, people used Taoist terminology. And even the word Tao itself occurs throughout Chinese Buddhism. I mentioned the book about Genjo Koan has been mentioned. The word Tao appears quite a lot in Genjo Koan, in Dogen. So Taoism is there in the background. And we can say that Zen is not just a confluence of two different forms of Buddhism. It also has a large Taoist element. And quite a bit of this can be put down to Tao Sheng. a key term here is the word li. Li is, how can you say? The original meaning of the word li was the grain. Like you look at a piece of timber, there is a grain in the timber. You look at the shell of a shelled animal, and there is a pattern. You look at nature generally, and you see many, many patterns. These are li. And in the Chinese way of thinking, these are a manifestation of the Tao. The Tao being, well, I'm sure you've read some material about the Tao. It's not an easy thing to define. But there is, in Chinese thinking, this notion of the Tao as the fundamental reality. The Tao is not directly perceptible, but manifests, functions in the world through the dialectic of yin and yang, and this generates patterns. And the word for these patterns is li. Now, the relevance of this to this evening's talk is that Bodhidharma, as was mentioned by Will, a very early text of Bodhidharma is the two entrances. One of these entrances is the entrance by li. So this is getting some sort of grip on what does li mean. It is quite important to try and understand what Bodhidharma was getting at. And you can see that in the mind of Tao Sheng, li played a hugely important part. I've recently been reading what is perhaps Tao Sheng's most famous book, which is the last book he wrote, which is his commentary on the Lotus Sutra. Well, the word li appears on every single page. The whole thing revolves around his notion of li. And it may be a Buddhist text, but here the commentary is very much focused on this Daoist terminology. So I think you can say that Tao Sheng's notion of Buddha nature is the li of each phenomenon. And if you apply that to people, that means the grain of your life. So, if I'm working as a psychotherapist, I can see that what I'm doing is trying to tune into the li of this particular person. There is a grain to the life of each person. Now, this gives a very different notion of what Buddha nature is from the one that one commonly finds in Western parlance. Because we have in the background of our culture notions like the immortal soul. And I'm sure that plenty of people think of Buddha nature rather in those sorts of terms, as something that is a kind of spiritual ultimate reality in the individual, but which is unchanging and is my Buddha nature different from your Buddha nature? We would have a sort of generalized idea about Buddha nature. Whereas the notion of li rather implies that the grain in two pieces of wood, well, it's never the same. Yeah? It's distinctive for each each piece of wood. And if you think about the patterns in water in a stream, they're never repeating. They're constantly unfolding, changing something. But there is that pattern there, which in the thinking of Taoism is very significant. So there's something here about flow rather than a sort of sense of something static. And this, I think, was very strong in the thinking of Tao Sheng, and was there in the background of Bodhidharma's, one of Bodhidharma's two entrances. Right, so of the two entrances, one is Li, and the other is so usually they're translated as the entrance through principle and the entrance through practice. But I think this is quite misleading. Practice, fair enough, that sort of fits. But the word that's translated as principle is Li. I think what I've said already must give you a sense that this is quite a distance from what we usually mean by principle. Again, principles are things that don't change, and they are constant over a number of examples. So the principles of whatever, mathematics, close to the word axiom, they're things that are fixed. Principles are unchanging. But I don't think that's what's implied in the mind of Tao Sheng, and so probably not in the mind of Bodhidharma either. So when Bodhidharma says that one form of entrance into the Dhamma is by means of Li, what he's talking about is direct, intuitive grasping of the Li of a situation, or the Li of a person, or the Li of a set of conditions. This would make a lot of sense to a Taoist. He would be reading the Tao of the situation. Because the aim of traditional Chinese religion, broadly, was to live in harmony with heaven and earth. We exist between heaven and earth, and we are in a way a joiner, a bridge between heaven and earth. And in this concept, heaven and earth are endlessly functioning, churning, you might say. So the sage, Taoist sage, Buddhist sage, Confucian sage, would be somebody who could discern, if not the Tao directly, at least its Li, its manifestation in whatever situation comes along. So in the meeting between two masters, and you've, I'm sure, read lots and lots of stories, of Zen stories, of meetings between masters. And Zen is famous for having produced this kind of literature. The Denku Roku, transmission of the lamp. They're all encounters between master and disciple. And many other stories are encounters between master and master, or sometimes disciple and disciple. But this business of encounter, it doesn't really have a precedent in India, even though the stories in Denku Roku go back to masters, or at least purport to represent what happened between masters and disciples in India. This literature was not produced in India, it was produced in China. And so it's characteristic, the whole notion of encounter and the notion of a intuitive reading of the other, and of the spontaneity of the meeting, that there could be a li of that meeting, which would be unique, would not be a grounding in some sort of principle. It would be a uniqueness of that meeting. And you read your books of koans, they're all meetings of this kind. So this is one of the entrances. In passing, we can note that the Chinese character for an entrance, for a way in, quite interestingly, I don't know whether this has significance or not, but all the Chinese words, all the Chinese characters are little pictures. So when you read them, you get more than just a intellectual definition. You get a visual picture of something, and the character for an entrance or for a way in is a very simple character of just 2 lines, and they look like roots going down into the ground. And so a way in here perhaps, has a feeling of like a plant pushing its way down into the ground, into the dark beneath the surface, which any psychoanalyst will tell you, if you have a dream like that, it's about the unconscious. So the dark wisdom is about reaching into the unconscious, intuitive part of the mind. And this is another way of talking about reading the grain of the situation and so on. Also, another little interesting quirk in a way is that same character is almost exactly the same as you might say in terms of the shape of characters and so on, of the character for a person turned around. The character for entry is like this, and is like this, and the character for man is the other way around. And the otherwise they're the same character. And the notion of turning around as being awakening, which does have an Indian background because it's the notion of paravritti, is very central to the whole idea of sudden awakening and so on. So one of Bodhidharma's entrances is the entrance by Li. The other entrance is the entrance by practice. And here, he has 4. He has a list of four practices. But I think these are, they sort of come out of that, the first principle in a way. They're a way of enacting, manifesting, bringing out. They're not an alternative to. They're often presented in books. You read about Bodhidharma's 2 entrances. You get a sort of sense of, well, you can either do it this way or you can do it that way. I don't think that's in Tao Sheng or Bodhidharma's mind at all. There is only one way, but there are different ways of describing the one way. So when you unpack it into these 4 categories, what do you get? Well, the first thing you get, Bodhidharma says, is to accept karma. And in particular, to accept what can you say, the retribution of karma, the fact that things come along and, in a sense, punish you. Life is punishing. And so you need forbearance. Yeah. So this puts the it's one of the parameters, isn't it? I see Richard's here, and we've been doing some classes on the parameters, and one of them we had a discussion of just the other night. Forbearance. In order to awaken spiritually, one needs to practice forbearance. And this is very closely related to a second one of Bodhidharma's list, which is to adapt to circumstances. So you must receive what comes. Something horrible comes. Thank you very much. This is the way of practice. And this is what you're taught. If you go on a strict Chinese Buddhist retreat, it's much less comfortable than going to San Francisco Zen Center, for instance. You're given a really rough time, and you learn, thank you very much. Whatever happens, even if you are unjustly criticized, you're told off for something you didn't do, you feel you make some small slip up or whatever, you get criticized, and you learn that what then comes up is all sorts of emotion, but you let it go. And this is awakening. This is letting go of the ego. So it's also, of course, attuning to the li of the situation, rather than trying to impose one's own ego upon it. And so this is how I think that the two sides of it sort of go together. So you express gratitude for the karma that comes along, which according to Buddhist theory you created long ago, one way or another. But thank you for coming back and showing me and teaching me and giving me this lesson. And you adapt to circumstances. And third point, you desire nothing. Now, I don't know, I'll hazard that desiring nothing is not just not desiring anything. Desiring nothing is it's a positive negative, if you like. A goal in Buddhism is shunyata, is nothingness, is emptiness. So to desire nothing is to desire shunyata, to desire to enter into that state in which li can manifest spontaneously, and you're not going to get in the way. So a lot of the sense here is that all would be fine if we didn't just keep getting in the way. So you can say that it's about letting go of our hang-ups. You'll know that famously, Bodhidharma spent 9 years facing a wall. What does this mean? Well, I mean, it's often taken literally. He spent 9 years sitting facing a wall. And in a Zen monastery now, you sit and not for 9 years, but for 40 minutes at a time, facing a wall. And this has become a literal standard practice, to sit on your zafu and face the wall. And my teacher, I was originally ordained in 1977 and studied with Brazier Roshi. And she used to say, well, when you're sitting, there's you, and there's the wall, and there's nothing wrong with the wall. So you had to face up to yourself. You had to face up to the ways in which you don't accept karma that comes along. And you didn't, therefore, permit the li of the situation to unfold. So I think it's quite possible that Bodhidharma's 9 years facing a wall were what we would mean if we take that metaphorically. Each of us has our walls. Each of us has our mental blocks, our hang-ups. And Bodhidharma may well have spent 9 years studying his own obstructions, hang-ups, call them what you like, complexes. Could use psychological language or common language. But we all have our walls. And Bodhidharma spent a long time studying his walls, I suggest. I may be wrong. The fourth of the four practices, I suppose I'd better mention this for completeness, is to practice the Dharma. Well, you might think that's obvious and straightforward, but what does it mean? The Dharma, what is Dharma? Dharma is fundamental reality. So practicing the Dharma, studying the Dharma, means living in accordance with reality. Now, I think you can see that this is just like the other three principles, just put slightly differently. Facing up to your karma, that's living with reality. Seeking for nothing, letting go of your greediness, this is living with reality. This is living with not giving up fantasies about what you're going to achieve and have and get and so on. So living with the Dhamma is realism. But it's realism within a context, I think, of a rather Taoistic sense of what reality is. Reality is this functioning, this churning of heaven and earth, and the unfolding of natural process. So these are the four practices which make up, we say, the second entrance. But actually, I think, as I said, I don't think these two different entrances are really different. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. I'll just mention in passing that another thing that Tao Sheng was famous for was for his statement that good deeds achieve no karma. There is no karmic consequence of good deeds, of truly good deeds. Now, you probably know the story, which may well be mythical, of Bodhidharma's encounter with the emperor. And what did Bodhidharma say in this encounter with the emperor? The emperor said, I have done all these good deeds. I have endowed monasteries, I have built stupas, I have supported the Sangha, I have built hospitals, I have done all sorts of good things. What is my merit? And Bodhidharma said, none whatsoever. Well, where did this idea come from? This idea came from Tao Sheng. It was already embedded in Chinese Buddhism, well before Bodhidharma, which has made me, one of the things that's made me wonder if this encounter did happen at all, which it may not have done, it may simply be a myth to make the point, as it were, an apocryphal story. But if it did happen, well, it is possible, as the story traditionally goes, that the emperor was mystified by what Bodhidharma said, and Bodhidharma left and went off to, what was the monastery he went to? Famous place. I think, out of my mind for the moment.
Yeah. Shaolin.
Yeah, Shaolin. Thank you very much. Went off to Shaolin Monastery and did all the things that he did there. This is possible, but it is also possible that the emperor was himself an advanced Buddhist practitioner and was perfectly familiar with Tao Sheng's principles and understood exactly what Bodhidharma was saying. And when he said, he followed it up by saying, well, who is it then who stands before me? He could well have been testing Bodhidharma to see whether he truly understood what this was all about. And Bodhidharma said, I don't know. I don't know who I am, which was in line with how Tao Sheng would have seen things. So it's quite possible that encounter, if it happened, was a way in which they each confirmed the other in their understanding of Buddhism, rather than being, as it's usually presented, Bodhidharma being clever and the emperor being stupid. And if it was in the way it's usually presented, I mean, I do wonder how Bodhidharma managed to leave the palace with his head still on his shoulders, because you don't say that sort of thing to an autocrat and make a fool of him and get away with it. So anyway, another thing to think about. So I hope some of what I've conveyed is how Bodhidharma's ideas were rooted in Chinese ideas of Buddhism that were well established in China. They were not, on the whole, things that he imported from India that the Chinese had never heard of before. Most of the principles that he taught in this two entrances schema are standard by that time. You know, they've been around for 100 years from a very famous predecessor in China, which gives an interesting sort of angle on how Zen really started. Bodhidharma also, we understand, much of his teaching did come from the Lankavatara Sutra, which he certainly did bring from India, and which is the basis of a great deal that we teach on our Buddhist psychology course, for instance. But in these two entrances, which are the famous thing that we're looking at this evening, I think the roots of them are in China, not in India. And I hope I've given you some things to think about. I haven't got to the absolute bottom of the mysteries that they present us with, but I think they're very interesting things to think about in terms of how one practices, what practice is about. So perhaps I'll wind up at this point and we'll see if there's questions or response.